Fighter jets roared across the sky. A red carpet stretched along the runway. Cameras flashed relentlessly. And then, silence. What if I told you that, on a freezing morning in Moscow, Russia rolled out the exact same protocol it reserves for superpower presidents, not for China, not for America, but for a 35-year-old captain from Burkina Faso. For 48 hours, Captain Ibrahim Traoré vanished inside Russia's most restricted facilities. No public agenda, no press releases, no military parades. And when the truth leaked, it wasn't about missiles. It was about something far more dangerous: knowledge. So here's the question. Why would the Kremlin treat a poor African nation like a nuclear state? And what exactly did Traoré bring back home that sent NATO analysts scrambling for answers? Stay with this story until the very end and tell me in the comments, is this the true beginning of Africa's independence or the opening act of a global confrontation? And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter. Not missiles, but something far more dangerous. The images were shocking not because they showed weapons, but because they didn't. For decades, every time an African leader traveled to Moscow, Paris, or Washington, the headlines were predictable: contracts for arms, pledges of military cooperation, and photo ops with generals in crisp uniforms. But this time was different. In the leaked footage, Captain Ibrahim Traoré was not shaking hands in gilded halls or reviewing soldiers on parade. He was inside industrial hangars, walking side by side with engineers, pointing at prototypes, asking questions that surprised even Russian technicians. Observers noted his focus. He asked about drone wings built from lightweight composites, not for carrying missiles, but for mapping farmland. He studied modular batteries designed to store solar energy in freezing winters and blistering desert summers. He watched demonstrations of water harvesting units capable of pulling drinking water from the air, even in arid climates. Every question he asked was about survival, not destruction. To the outside world, this shift seemed almost unbelievable. Why would a young African officer demand access to research labs usually sealed off even to Russia's closest allies? Why would the Kremlin, known for its secrecy, allow cameras, however blurry and unofficial, to capture these moments? Some analysts suggested it was a calculated gamble. By opening restricted facilities, Moscow was signaling a new kind of partnership, not merely weapons for loyalty, but knowledge for alignment. Others argued it was proof that Russia, under increasing pressure from the West, was searching for new allies in unconventional ways. And who better than a leader young enough to carry the future, bold enough to reject dependency, and popular enough across Africa to inspire millions? In Ouagadougou, the silence of those 2 days became the loudest message of all. Citizens tuned into local radio shows, hearing commentators speculate about what their president was doing in Moscow. Some callers insisted he must be negotiating a defense treaty. Others laughed at the idea, pointing to the lack of any official statement. One elderly man said on air, "If he comes back with blueprints instead of bullets, then for the first time in my life, I will believe we can stand on our own." Meanwhile, in Paris, the reaction was less hopeful and more panicked. France had long positioned itself as the guarantor of stability in its former colonies. But if Burkina Faso could bypass French infrastructure loans, bypass French technology contracts, and instead adapt Russian research for local use, then the very foundation of French influence in West Africa would crack. French officials quietly demanded explanations from Moscow. None came. Across the Atlantic, American analysts debated in closed rooms. One internal report leaked to journalists bluntly stated, if replicated across the Sahel, These technologies undermine the leverage of traditional aid and loans. A self-reliant Burkina Faso is not a threat in isolation, but as an example, it could prove destabilizing to U.S. and European influence in the region. But perhaps the most revealing moment came not from officials, but from a single blurry clip uploaded online. In it, Traoré stood in front of a whiteboard scribbled with diagrams in both Russian and French. He pointed to a sketch of a solar grid, then circled the word local. The engineer beside him nodded. That video, only 30 seconds long, was shared hundreds of thousands of times across African social media within hours. Its caption, written by a Malian student, said everything. He went for tools, not toys. That phrase became a rallying cry for young Africans frustrated with constant lectures about democracy while their villages lacked water and electricity. Traoré's silence spoke louder than any speech. He was not asking the world for permission. He was asking for schematics and then bringing them home. In that silence, the balance of power began to shift. NATO may have seen a security threat. France may have seen the erosion of its sphere of influence. But ordinary Africans saw something else entirely, a man treating knowledge as a weapon and survival as a strategy. And when Traoré finally reappeared, stepping once more off the Russian presidential jet onto the Ouagadougou tarmac, escorted by MiG-29 fighters again blazing across the sky, the symbolism was complete. Burkina Faso had not signed a single treaty, yet somehow, without words, it had declared a new kind of independence. The world was left with one burning question: if survival can be engineered, what else can be rebuilt? When NATO starts to panic, the silence of Moscow's winter corridors echoed across the world. For 48 hours, there were no press releases, no public statements, no parades, and yet the absence of official ceremony became louder than any military fanfare. Analysts, journalists, and ordinary citizens began piecing together the fragments, and what emerged shocked capitals from Paris to Washington. In Brussels, NATO officials were the first to raise alarms. A classified briefing, later leaked to the press, described the Russian fighter escort of Traoré's arrival as symbolically unprecedented, escorting a young African officer as though he were the leader of a nuclear state sent shivers through the alliance. "This is not theater," one NATO analyst remarked. "It is messaging. Russia is signaling that its partnerships in Africa are no longer peripheral, they are central to its strategy." But what truly unsettled NATO was not the jets. It was the reports that followed. Instead of negotiating for missiles, Traoré had been photographed inside energy labs, agricultural drone hangars, and prototype workshops. A senior official summed it up: "We know how to counter weapons with weapons. But how do you counter the transfer of survival technology?" That question hung heavy in every Western war room. In Paris, the panic was more visceral. France had spent decades weaving itself into the economic fabric of West Africa. Its financial influence flowed through the CFA franc. Its political influence was maintained by infrastructure loans. Its military presence was secured by counterterrorism bases. But suddenly, none of that looked stable. Within weeks of Traoré's return, local Burkinab media reported small pilot projects, solar water grids, modular classrooms, and low-cost irrigation units. Paris scrambled to respond. French envoys rushed to Ouagadougou offering cooperative research programs, but their timing betrayed desperation. As one Burkinab radio host mocked, "When Moscow opens the door, Paris remembers the knock." Across the Atlantic, Washington's reaction was quieter, but no less intense. Intelligence analysts gathered in closed sessions, combing through satellite images and leaked videos. The absence of weapons transfers was almost as alarming as their presence would have been. One declassified note later revealed the lack of visible military exchange suggests intent beyond defense. Burkina Faso may be shifting toward technological self-sufficiency, which reduces U.S. leverage over time. For American policymakers, the challenge was not immediate conflict, but precedent. If one African nation could leapfrog dependency through knowledge transfer, others might follow. A domino effect across the Sahel would weaken the very tools Washington had relied on for decades: aid, sanctions, and strategic loans. As one Pentagon advisor put it, a blueprint can be copied, a missile cannot. Meanwhile, in Africa, the mood was electric. Social media lit up with grainy clips of Traoré walking calmly through Russian facilities, nodding at engineers, sketching diagrams. Hashtags spread across Mali, Niger, and Chad. Just tools, not toys, and blueprints for freedom. For a generation raised on broken promises of democracy and endless IMF programs, the symbolism was explosive. Traoré was not photographed begging for loans. He was photographed asking for schematics. One commentator on a Malian news channel said it bluntly: "Our leaders used to return with debt. He returns with instructions." The line went viral. Inside Burkina Faso, radio call-in shows buzzed with pride. Villagers who had never cared about geopolitics suddenly debated the significance of water harvesting machines and off-grid batteries. A teacher in Bobo Dioulasso told listeners, "For the first time, our children might learn to build instead of waiting to receive." The excitement was not abstract. It was practical. Ordinary people could imagine the direct impact of these technologies on their daily survival. And yet, with the excitement came unease. Western think tanks warned of potential instability. If Burkina Faso stepped too far outside the orbit of Western aid structures, it could face sanctions or diplomatic isolation. But others cautioned against underestimating the symbolic power of the moment. In the words of a British analyst, he has changed the conversation. Africa is no longer asking for protection. It is asking for replication. The climax came not from a speech, but from an image. When Traoré stepped once more onto Burkinab soil, descending from the Russian presidential jet, flanked by roaring MiG-29s, the crowd gasped, not at his presence, but at what it implied. Here was a young African officer treated with the protocol of a superpower leader, and yet his most powerful weapon was not an army. It was a briefcase filled with blueprints. That briefcase passed down the jet stairs by a nameless aide before Traoré emerged, became legend within hours. Rumors swirled. Was it cash, classified documents, a weapons contract? Weeks later, the truth began to seep out in fragments. Inside rural schools, packages appeared, cloth charts with coding diagrams, manuals for solar water pumps, blueprints for modular classrooms. The realization spread like wildfire. The briefcase did not carry weapons. It carried instructions. And so, the world was forced to confront a terrifyingly simple question. If blueprints can spread faster than bullets, who really controls the future? Proof, not promises, a new kind of politics. In the dusty northern provinces of Burkina Faso, the impact was felt first, not in speeches, but in schools. Teachers who once struggled with crumbling chalkboards and outdated books now rolled out cloth charts printed with logic diagrams. Children traced programming concepts with chalk, learning the skeleton of coding long before they ever touched a computer. For a nation where rural literacy rates still lag, the introduction of knowledge systems, however rudimentary, was revolutionary. In the drought-stricken East, farmers gathered around small, jury-rigged drones assembled from recycled batteries and salvaged wires. These makeshift machines did not carry cameras of war, but sensors measuring soil moisture. With each flight, communities discovered where to plant, when to irrigate, and how to survive the scorching Sahel sun. The difference was immediate. Fields that had long produced little more than dust now showed patches of green. Women who bore the heaviest burdens of fuel collection and water gathering saw change most visibly. In community centers from Koudougou to Bobo Dioulasso, new workshops taught women and teenage girls how to repair solar lamps, maintain low-voltage batteries, and assemble basic water filtration kits. Mothers who once spent hours walking for firewood now found themselves soldering wires, building devices that kept their households lit after sunset. For teenage girls, the empowerment was greater still, an entry point into technical literacy that had always felt out of reach. This transformation was not orchestrated from the top. It was spreading horizontally, village to village, carried in photocopied manuals and hand-drawn schematics. What had once arrived through foreign NGOs and aid agencies was now emerging from within communities themselves. Instead of waiting for shipments, citizens replicated diagrams, translated manuals into local languages, and built with whatever materials they had on hand. The effect was not charity, it was capacity. Inside government halls, the shift produced tension. Ministries accustomed to slow-moving bureaucratic processes suddenly found themselves behind. Cabinet meetings grew heated. Should these grassroots projects be integrated into formal budgets or allowed to evolve independently? Some ministers worried about the loss of control. Others saw opportunity, a chance to ride the wave of popular innovation. But the reality was clear. The people were building faster than the state could regulate. For a country scarred by 8 coups since independence, the meaning was profound. Stability in Burkina Faso had always been judged by speeches, parades, and military presence. Now, legitimacy was being measured differently. A leader was not judged by what he promised, but by what his people could build. A $3 water pump assembled from scrap copper became more persuasive than any campaign slogan. A classroom lit by recycled solar panels spoke louder than any party manifesto. International observers took note. In Paris, policymakers worried about the erosion of influence through the CFA franc and infrastructure loans. Offers of new credit lines were quietly made, but equally quietly rejected. In Washington, reports warned that Burkina Faso was pioneering a model of modernization outside both Western aid structures and Chinese state investment frameworks. The phrase non-aligned modernization began circulating in think tanks. In neighboring capitals, the reaction was contagious. Delegations from Mali, Niger, and Chad arrived in Ouagadougou, not with politicians, but with teachers, electricians, and agronomists. They came not to negotiate treaties, but to observe workshops, study manuals, and carry knowledge back home. For the first time, West African diplomacy was being conducted not through official communiques, but through the silent exchange of blueprints and prototypes. Meanwhile, international NGOs were forced to reconsider their approach. For decades, their model had been to ship pre-built solutions into African villages. But with the spread of open-source designs, communities now demanded something different: funding for replication, not donation. Tool libraries, repair hubs, and translation workshops replaced glossy projects and ribbon-cutting ceremonies. One American Foundation director admitted, "This is not charity anymore, it is capacity, and it travels faster than aid." The political consequences inside Burkina Faso deepened. Opposition groups who had long criticized the government suddenly found themselves without their usual ammunition. How do you campaign against water pumps that work? How do you argue against classrooms already lit at night? Even those who distrusted Traoré's military roots found themselves acknowledging that his silence had birthed tangible results. Politics was no longer about ideology. It was about proof. On the ground, rallies changed character. No longer did they focus on abstract promises of democracy or sovereignty. Instead, speakers asked, how many villages have lit classrooms? How many farmers now irrigate their fields? The applause was not for slogans, but for numbers, for prototypes, for evidence. And yet, lurking behind the pride was a question that made both local and global actors uneasy. Could this new legitimacy last? Would the momentum of grassroots replication continue, or would it collapse under the weight of political rivalries and resource shortages? The paradox was clear. By demanding blueprints instead of bullets, Traoré had shifted the measure of leadership, but he had also raised the stakes. If survival could be engineered, then failure to deliver would not be blamed on foreigners, but on Burkina Faso itself. And so the question spread from village radios to global think tanks. Had Traoré planted the seed of a new African model, or a fragile experiment destined to collapse under its own weight? China, France, America, all caught off guard. In Washington, confusion turned into quiet alarm. Analysts warned that if Burkina Faso learned to stand on its own through technical replication, the very tools America had relied upon in Africa, aid packages, sanctions, and military partnerships, would lose their bite. Yet others saw something hauntingly familiar in Traoré's experiment. Older veterans remembered the years after World War II when the GI Bill allowed U.S. soldiers to return not as beggars, but as builders, raising homes, farms, and universities through skill and education. To them, the sight of Burkinab children learning coding on cloth charts felt like déjà vu. Military colleges in the U.S. began examining Traoré's method. One strategist described it as waging peace like a campaign, military discipline redirected not at enemies, but at survival itself. Water security, food production, decentralized energy. It is logistics applied to life, a colonel remarked. And once, America spoke this language too. Policy debates split the capital. Some demanded more aid and pressure, fearing that Burkina Faso's example would unravel decades of American influence. Others insisted that the U.S. should pivot, become a coach instead of a creditor, offering open-source support, teacher exchanges, and agricultural fellowships. If we don't adapt, warned one think tank voice, we'll be irrelevant in the very regions we claim to stabilize. Paris, meanwhile, grew defensive. French policymakers feared that replication politics might sweep West Africa, eroding the power of the CFA franc. In private, one diplomat admitted the unthinkable: you cannot sanction a photocopy. In Brussels, energy executives panicked. If off-grid solar and water projects spread, Africa's need for European-backed loans would shrink. What unsettled them most was not technology, but psychology. A continent once told it could not survive without outside financing was now building from scraps, and succeeding. Beijing also watched carefully. China's model in Africa had always been massive infrastructure in exchange for resources. But Burkina Faso had carved out a third path, neither Western aid nor Chinese loans, but community-driven replication. Chinese strategists quietly admitted that this open-source independence threatened their model too. Even NGOs felt the shift. For years, they shipped pre-made solutions. Now communities pushed back. They wanted resources for replication, not handouts. Repair hubs, tool libraries, and translation workshops were valued more than glossy aid projects. This spreads faster than charity, admitted one American NGO director. The global reality was stark. Weapons can be controlled. Loans can be restricted, but knowledge, once shared, is almost impossible to contain. As one British analyst put it, Traoré is not fighting the system, he is replacing it. And that leaves America with a choice. Will it resist this transformation or embrace it, reconnecting with its own values of self-reliance, education, and dignity? So let me ask you, if you were in Washington's shoes, would you fight to keep control or adapt to a world where blueprints spread faster than bullets? Tell me in the comments. I'm reading every response. The road ahead. The return of the Russian presidential jet to Ouagadougou did not end the story. It began a new chapter. The image of the black briefcase, carried down the stairs by a nameless aide before Captain Ibrahim Traoré emerged, became the enduring symbol. At first, rumors spread wildly. Some claimed it held cash. Others whispered about secret contracts or intelligence files. But as weeks passed, the truth began surfacing in fragments. Inside rural schools, cloth charts appeared with diagrams explaining how to wire solar panels. In villages, teachers unrolled instructions for modular classrooms